This paper is framed particularly in part as a response and development of an application of the intuition that Philip articulated in his recent mystical sociology, on the one hand, and it's also, in many ways, a response and development of Elliot Wolfson's um, trajectory of textual analysis and phenomenological analysis of Chabad thought, and added to that something of a historical perspective, which I guess is influenced by others in the room, Tali, also Ada Rappaport, and others like that. So all of those things are playing into what I'm going to say, and I'm not going to read the entire paper that was shared, but I want to focus in on some highlights. So first of all, I also want to use it to respond to some of the things that were already said over the last night and today. So first of all, I think my paper mirrors Eliot's in two important respects. The first is that Eliot began by affirming the intuition that Philip developed in his mystical sociology, which I would describe as uh, Philip's intuition is that the phenomenology of Hasidism is fundamentally social in its constitution. That is to say, that we shouldn't just be thinking about Hasidism within a social context. We shouldn't just be thinking about the ways that Hasidism played out and historically the different social constructs that informed it and so on. We should be thinking about the ways that Hasidism itself has a social constitution. There's something about Hasidism or the phenomenology of Hasidism, even the mystical aspects of Hasidism, the mystic experience in Hasidism, that is fundamentally sociological or social in its core. So I'm going to be following. Last night we heard from Eliot. Eliot developed that in a textual, affirmed it textually, showed us the textual trajectory, bearing out some of that insight. So I'm going to be doing some of that as well. And also my paper turns to the question of the particular and the universal, difference and the overcoming of difference, and the need to somehow preserve the former, that is, to preserve difference, even as the overcoming of difference is realized, or as Eliot put it last night, to keep walking the path, even as we step beyond the path. So one thought that occurred to me last night, which speaks directly to this, and which wasn't in my paper, but the beginnings of this idea were in my paper, and this is just a thought that I'm still developing, is that if we take the argument that Randall Collins developed in his ritual interactions, Randall Collins develops an idea there about the distinction between two models of individuality. There's the modern sense of individuality, which is one of not necessarily of narcissism, but of a turning to the self and a rejection, being antisocial, introversion, and being antisocial. It's a retreat from society. And he juxtaposes that with what he describes as the pre-modern sense of the individual experience, which he says was fundamentally about the collective. So what he says over there, and he talks mainly about, for example, in monasteries, where first of all there's a regime, it's a social commune, there's certain things that they do every day, and that within that context, the individual experience is cultivated. But more so, he says that the individual experience is a representation of something collective. So that's an idea which you could say is borne out in Hasidic thought. And you could maybe argue that Hasidism is, in some sense, a survival of this pre-modern form of individuality, which even in its inward state embraces the collective. And that's something which in the paper I go into and discuss how in Tanya, the Alter Rebbe very clearly articulates such a model. And if we have time, I'll talk about that soon. But what I was thinking last night is that we can also apply this to if we take it away from the personal level, and we talk about this same paradigm on the national level, and we say that when we talk about the particularism of the Jewish people, that particularism is itself a collective representation. So when the Jewish people talk about what is special about the Jewish people, they're talking about what they can do for the world. So that itself, that turning inwards, is itself in some way an embrace of the whole. So that's just a thought which still needs to be developed and probed, but I'm putting it out there. Okay. So another important element that I introduced in the paper relates to a question that Nathaniel posed last night as we were talking. He asked, following up on especially on Eliot's paper, if indeed the ontological truth is that all diversity is subsumed within the singular being of the divine essence. So then the question arises, where does divisiveness come from? And of course, you can answer this in many ways, and the classic Kabbalistic, Hasidic answer is going to be Tzimtzum. But I want to answer this question by returning to my paper and talking about the body. And this brings us to chapter 32 of Tanya, which is famously... So, chapter 32 of Tanya is often today in Chabad we say that this is the heart of Tanya because the Hebrew letters Lamed Beis 32 spell the word heart, and this is something that was affirmed by the Rebbe. And not only that, he extended it to the point where he said that not only is it the heart of the Tanya, and therefore by extension the heart of Hasidic thought, Hasidic teaching, it is the heart of the entire Torah, because, and this again reflects the statement of Hillel, that the commandment to love your fellow is the heart of the entire Torah. So what does this have to do with the body? So the way this is framed within Tanya is as part of a discussion about depression and how to overcome depression. And in doing so, he says as follows, and now I'm quoting from, I guess, my own translation. This is actually in chapter 31. This you shall settle in your heart, saying to your heart, yes, it is correct, without doubt, that I am ultimately very far from God and despised and despicable. In other words, we're talking to somebody here who is depressed because of his lowly station. He feels that he is a failure as a servant of God, or for whatever other reasons. And the answer that you give to this truth, that you are indeed a failure, is that yet all that is on the part of myself alone. That is to say, the body and the vivifying soul that is vested in the body. Nevertheless, within me there is a literal part of God that is even present in a kal shebakalim, which translates, it's a representative of society at its most vacuous, most frivolous, an empty person. Even an empty person has a literal part of God within, a divine soul, a literal spark of God vested in it to give it life. And this soul is in a state of exile. So there's two things here. There's my body, there's what I experience as myself, but which is not my true self. And then there is the divine within me. And if I tear these two apart, then I can overcome my depression, because I can say, yes, my body, okay. But that's not who I am. I am a part of God, and I shall direct all my aim and desire to extricate her, the soul, and raise her up from this exile, that she shall be encompassed and united with God when I direct all my aim into Torah and the commandments. So embrace the soul and leave the problems of the body behind. That's chapter 31. Chapter 32 continues to say that when you practice this contemplative exercise and raise the soul above the body and celebrate the joy of the soul, so this is also a direct and easy way to approach and fulfill the commandment to love your fellow as yourself, because you have already achieved a state of mind where your body is contemptible on your part, and the soul and the spirit, who knows their greatness and loftiness in their root and source in the living God. So the soul and spirit, who knows where a person's soul and spirit arises from? Who knows where a person, the real nature of the individual? And so if you can achieve this perception, then you know that there is in fact no difference. They are all alike. There is no difference between one soul and another. There is one Father to all of them, only that their bodies are divided. So it is the body that comes between people. It is the body that is the seat, the cause of, it is the body that mediates our perception, warps our perception, and brings us to this state where we experience ourselves and the people around us as different, as divided, separated beings. And through this contemplative, which has a kind of ascetic orientation, but not necessarily in practice, as that's a separate discussion. It does have a very clear ascetic orientation of looking at the body as something despicable. But if we put that in the broader context of the teachings in Tanya and elsewhere in Chabad thought, it doesn't necessarily lead to ascetic practice in the sense that you might imagine, or that is associated with earlier Kabbalistic movements, with Hasidic Ashkenaz and so on. But that's a point that I'll leave aside. One thing that I do want to say about this is that this has there's a sociological element here as well. This ties into a contemporary discussion. The sociologist Brian Turner, in his 1986 book, The Body and Society, he notes at the outset that contemporary sociology has previously had little to say about the most obvious fact of human existence, namely that human beings have, and to some extent are, bodies. And his whole book is dedicated to articulating different ways in which the body is either regulated in society or informs social constructs and so on. And in his concluding chapter, he says, I think these may even be the concluding words of the book, or close to that. He says, bodies may be governed, but embodiment is the phenomenological basis of individuality. And I think here we have, in chapter 32 of Tanya, we have a prefiguring of exactly this formulation, that embodiment is the phenomenological basis of individuality, and it is in overcoming the prism of the body, the prison that the body imposes, that we can overcome the biases of individuality. Okay, so that's all pretty theoretical. 5 more minutes. Okay, so now I want to turn to, from the Alter Rebbe, the first generation of Chabad, I want to turn to the last generation of Chabad, to the seventh Rebbe, and to one part that I'm going to skip over here is, and just mention very briefly, is that in the paper I go into the idea that the Rebbe developed, that although ostensibly the commandment to love one's fellow is interpreted by the halachic tradition to include only your brethren in the commandments, which would exclude not only non-Jews but also Jewish sinners, the Alter Rebbe, already the first Chabad Rebbe, makes the leap of saying that Jewish sinners or sinners and Kal Shebakalim are included in this. And the Rebbe, although he doesn't make this explicit, there are a number of texts which I point to where the Rebbe makes a very strong gesture in the direction that this is actually an inclusive commandment that applies to everybody. And so all the principles articulated in Hasidic thought about Ahavat Yisrael, about love of one's fellow, and how it works, and the contemplative methods that bring you to love of your fellow, all of these can be applied on a universal basis. The first, and I think the key text here, is a 1986 talk, where he talks generally about commandments that have social value. And he says any commandment that has social value applies equally to every person. Very interestingly, he applies this to the laws of mourning and to the observance of Yartzeit, observing the anniversary of a person's death, and using that as a platform for memory and to reaffirm that person's life, to continue their life. And he clearly, explicitly applies this to everybody on the basis that all commandments that have social value and which contribute to the what I'm calling in this paper the reconstruction of society is universally applicable, even if the halachic authorities did not include it in explicit discussions of what are called the 7 Noachide laws. There are other texts that point in this direction, but I'll leave that for now. Okay, so finally, I want to turn here to a text from the 7th Rebbe, where he talks about he uses a proof text, which is a very interesting proof text, a very cryptic text. It exists in several manuscripts, and it is said, and there are various traditions attesting, some of them conflicting in various details, but generally the idea is that this is a text that the Alter Rebbe, Rabbi Shneur Zalman, the first Rebbe, wrote very close to his own passing. It's known as the Nefesh HaShvela, the lowly soul, because that is how it begins. And here I'm going to read. This is an excerpt from an already short text. The soul that is in its root lowly in perfect truth, its vocation is physical Torah, whether for herself or to provide understanding for others, and whether in doing physical kindness through bringing minds closer and offering solutions from afar in all household affairs, though most of them are falsehoods, it is impossible that it be otherwise, that you should do true kindness. So he's saying true kindness is impossible, and therefore truth in some way is impossible. There is no truth other than Torah. Truth said, do not create. Truth said, this is a midrashic reference, truth said that the world should not be created because people will do bad, people will be false, the world will be full of falsehoods. Kindness said, create, for the world will be full of kindness. And truth was sent to the ground, thrown to the ground, and the world was built with kindness that is not of truth. So this is a very interesting text where Rabbi Shneur Zalman is saying we need to cast aside truth in order to do kindness. Okay, and the Rebbe makes a very important intervention over here, and what he says is that this is not in fact a casting aside of truth. Actually, this is in engaging with the falsehoods of the world, with engaging with the mundane, with household affairs, helping people in their daily lives, bringing minds closer, even though you're dealing with, in the real world, you're dealing with problematic issues, you're dealing with falsehoods, you're dealing with people who are full of vice, and their conflicts arise from this vice. You have to leave aside your lofty aspirations and engage in helping, in Torah, in physical Torah, in household concerns, in bringing minds closer. But this is not an abandonment of truth. The measure of truth, so he makes a distinction here between the essential truth of God and the measure of divine truth. The measure of divine truth is one of God's qualities. In the Kabbalistic frame of reference, we would say it is one of the midot of Atzilut. It is a property of God, a character trait of God. God acts with kindness. He acts with truth. These are modes of divine, discrete, defined modes of divine expression. But then there is the essence of divine truth, the truth of God's essence, which is beyond any particular character. And so the Rebbe says that the measure of truth can only reach the place where divine truth is recognizable, where it's obvious, where it's clear that this is a divine truth. Because the measure of truth is circumscribed. It is defined as truth, and it has to therefore be truth. The measure of truth, and so because the world is full of falsehood, where the truth of God is not recognizable, so truth said, do not create. The measure of truth said, do not create the world. The infinite truth of God's essence, by contrast, has no constraint. It is not circumscribed by the need for God's truth to be recognizable. For even in a place of hiding and concealment, even including such a concealment that appears to be a falsehood, in truth and in its interiority, its entire existence is the truth of the essence. I'll leave it at that.